All right, well, everyone, thank you for joining us. We are really excited to have Ed Ingle join us for this session on government relations ethics during a U.S. presidential election year. As most of us know, in the political realm, so much of what we see of public relations is what is carried out in the public relations or the public affairs realm on cable news or in the heat of election cycles. A lot of the minute-by-minute media coverage that we see in the political realm and in public affairs, a lot of the public perception of what people think public relations is what they see in that realm. And so it's really interesting that we are in the midst of this right now. And of course, tonight we have a US presidential election debate going on tonight. And so I think that this session is particularly well timed. We have today a session presenter on the issue of ethics in government relations and the author of a book chapter in the new edition of Reputation Management. I've got my copy right here. Ed Ingle joins us with the firm New Lantern in Vienna, Virginia, in the Washington, D.C. area. And he is also a strategic advisor of Poligage, a consultancy that he is going to be talking to us about. And as we are, very soon away from this presidential election cycle, he's going to be telling us a lot about his prior experience with companies like Microsoft and of course with WPP, as well as having worked in, inside the White House earlier in his career, about 20 years ago. And he's going to guide us through a lot of the different aspects of ethical compliance as it is relevant to lobbying and different aspects of government relations and practice, whether it's in a presidential election year or whether it's during any type of construct or different application when making outreach to elected officials. So I'm very excited to have Ed Ingle with us, and Ed will let you take it away from here.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Happy to join you today. It's first of all, let me just say I applaud PRCA for getting so much focus on ethics. I think it's an important, not just a topic, but it really underpins and provides the foundation for which all of us to do our very best work. Whether that's in government relations, public affairs, etc. I mean, I equate, I equate ethics and intending to, to everything around ethics and the principles as somewhat equivalent to foundation of a house or a building, particularly when that house or structure is under stress in any number of shapes or forms, it can eventually fail. And the same thing is really true in our business. And I have sort of practiced this and used that as sort of my North Star. Whenever it's ethics in my mind is never a destination that we'll ever get to exactly, but it is a journey. And if you sort of keep in front of mind that it is foundational to everything that we do and allows us to be successful and to minimize failure, then we're on the right plane. But again, kudos to you guys. Mary Beth mentioned, she said, well, 20 years ago, I'm of the age now where I round down. I used to round up. When you're younger and you've got, let's say, 8 or 9 years of experience, and you tend to round that up to 10 years, or you'd round something up to 15 years. Well, I'm now this year, I'm at this sort of government affairs, public affairs, government service business for now 35 years. And up to a couple of years ago, I still said that I have over 25 years of experience, which is true, correct? But I did finally start saying over 30 years, but literally this year is my 35th year. Nevertheless, as Mary Beth suggested, let me lay out a little bit of walks through my biography, because I do think that will help in showing how it has shaped me and how I have, particularly when it comes to election years and engagement, but all else in between, how that has shaped me and how, in sort of on integrity, ethics, etc. I got my Bachelor's of Science in Communication, actually from the University of Tennessee. That's where Mary Beth and I know each other. I think we've known each other for close to probably almost 20 years. I'm not going to age her, serving on the Board of Visitors for the college. But I went on from UT directly at the Indiana University, where I have my Master's in Public Affairs. And from there, and that was a 2-year program, and in some places call it Master of Public Administration. From there, I went to Washington, D.C., where I've remained ever since, in 1985. And I started at the White House Office of Management and Budget, which was the budget and program, which providing program and budget analysis for the Executive Office of the President and the government. And that was a great training ground for me for sort of becoming sort of a policy expert. I was overseeing EPA's budgets and some related energy budgets at the time. From there, after 4 years, that's when I joined the firm as a bipartisan firm that had been in business about 8 years. It's gone by several names, but it was a firm founded by Ann Wexler. And more recently, it was Wexler and Walker Public Policy Associates, but it was owned by, a year after I joined, it was bought by WPP. And it was really one of the first toes in the water that WPP or any giant international communication company were sort of high up government relations and government relations and government affairs lobbying firms. And so anyway, I was there and ran the energy and environmental practice for 12 years, but that's where I really learned about the world of government relations, public affairs, et cetera. And of course, being owned by WPP and working with companies very closely like Hill and Knowlton, et cetera, I got a lot of good training on the public relations side as well. It was working with people like Ann Wexler, who had been in the President Carter's White House, and she had brought on an early partner out of who had worked for then going all the way back to Governor Reagan before he became president, Nancy Reynolds. So you had a bipartisan firm in DC, which was uniquely run by 2 women, and it was also bipartisan. And so it was, it really to this day is the longest running bipartisan firm in Washington, D.C. And I learned a lot from both Ann and Nancy and others, in that, your word is your bond, and that you owe it to your clients to speak candidly with them and give them your best counsel. And I also learned from them, we did not take every potential client that came knocking on our door. And so nevertheless, from there, I had the opportunity to go to work on the Republican convention in 2000, where I ran the speech operation. And this was the convention where George W. Bush, as some refer to as Bush 43, was a candidate, a governor of Texas, and running. And I managed the speech operation, which was all the speech development and all the vetting through the campaign, et cetera, et cetera. And then that turned into a role at the presidential transition, which is very topical right now, obviously, if you think about the possibility of a Biden administration. But I was, and as many of you know, from the 2000 election, that wasn't decided in one day. That wasn't decided in 2 days or 3 days. It took several weeks, and there was a lot of recounting in Florida, and the Supreme Court had to step in. And I hope, we don't go through that sort of thing again this time around. But nevertheless, during that time, I was part of literally like half a dozen people who started the informal transition that became the formal transition, about 2.5 weeks later, when the Supreme Court made its decision and said that George W. Bush was president. But that was great training for me again on how how to work with government, working and in crisis management and crisis mode, and a very chaotic atmosphere. And from there, I started day one at the Bush White House, sworn in with the other senior staff members, there at the White House on January 22nd, 2001. And I was deputy assistant to the president for cabinet affairs. So it was my job to coordinate with the cabinet. And having done that, and by the time we had all as a White House had figured out what about our roles and working well together, 9/11 came. September 11, 2001 came. And that really was dramatic and changed a lot of different things. And in my role, it meant that I had to coordinate very closely with all the different agencies who had some role to play in the sort of post 9/11 attack, and the planning that went into standing up the new Department of Homeland Security. And so that was a real lesson, obviously, in crisis management, but it was also a real lesson on no matter every White House that comes in, is well prepared, generally speaking, and has the playbooks from previous administrations to rely on through the transition. But this was very different. And so it was a lesson that no matter how well planned you think you are, something that you hadn't planned for may occur. So I'd spent 3 years at the White House in that cabinet affairs role, and then left in 2003 to go to Microsoft, where I had remained for 16 years up until last September, so a year ago. At Microsoft, I was responsible for all things government affairs based out of Washington, D.C., but over that period of time, I ran our executive branch work, our relationship with the executive branch, our lobbying activities on Capitol Hill. I managed our general broad political activities. I ran the state and local government activities and working with the governors, et cetera. I never during that period of time owned the work that we did in foreign capitals, but worked, as you could expect, very closely with my colleagues who worked around the globe and who, like me, sat in foreign capitals and worked on behalf of Microsoft. And it was interesting during my first couple of years, Microsoft hired me in large part because they had just had several years of coming through their antitrust battles and they finally signed a consent decree in the late part of 2002 with the federal government and a whole bunch of state attorneys general. And so they had finally turned the corner from that and had that in their rearview mirror, and they wanted to then be able to work with an administration, the Bush administration in this case, and not be so preoccupied on the antitrust issues. And they hired me to really help with the relationships with the Bush administration as well as manage our work on the Hill. Well, no sooner had I been at Microsoft did our friends in the European Union come knocking on our door for a lot of the same reasons that the Justice Department had on a lot of these antitrust and competition issues. So I went to school pretty quickly on the role that regulatory agencies play and enforcement agencies play, not only in the United States, but across the globe, and how that can impact your company and call it a question. And obviously there are big reputational risks there and big integrity issues, et cetera, if you are seen as a company as not playing by the rules. So nevertheless, we'll come back to Microsoft and maybe, and some of the other examples and some of the other Q&A. I will say that I also, at Microsoft, ran all our presidential election and our general US-based elections strategies every 4 years for presidential, and of course every 2 years for US House of Representatives. And of course, at the state level, some of those governors are coming up on every year, 2 years, et cetera. And so I managed our work and how we engage these governments during these transitions, and particularly spent a lot of time and effort, as you might think, on how we were positioning ourselves in 2004, whether it's going to be a second term for President Bush or John Kerry was running against him at the time. In 2008, when that was John McCain v. Barack Obama. And then in 2012, when it was Romney against an incumbent President Obama, and then in 2016 when it was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. And as I say these names, even yourself, you can think about through the years, just during that period of time, how there were some unexpected turns, and so it became very important, and we almost learned the hard way. And we weren't alone. For example, in 2008, all the way back in 2007, when a young Senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, was running against, Hillary Clinton, who'd been Hillary Clinton, who'd been senator of New York, and obviously the wife of an eight-year president. No one was giving Barack Obama much of a chance. And so a lot of corporate America was spending a lot of time building relationships during the primary with then Senator Clinton. And so obviously during the primary, that resulted in Barack Obama being the victor and running against John McCain. And so we, like so many others, had to pivot to build those relationships with Barack Obama in the event that he would ultimately be president. And we did build the relationships with a John McCain in those days. And ultimately, Barack Obama was the victor. And so we were fairly well positioned. But again, we were a little bit slow out of the gate because of some of the early relationship building that we'd done during the primary with Hillary Clinton. And then in 2012, once again, you had a popular incumbent. And so it was my job working across the company to make sure that we were continuing to build relationship, with an incumbent president, but at the same time, build a relationship with the Romney campaign in the event that he was going to win. And so, ultimately, obviously, President Obama was reelected, and then that brought us to 2016. And having had the experience in 2008 and during the primary that I'd mentioned, in 2016, no one was really giving Donald Trump, when he entered the race, that he would not become the nominee, much less become the president. And so all along the way, I led the teams that made sure that no matter who we thought would emerge from the primary, that we had at least started some bit of relationship with every one of the candidates. And so as soon as it became apparent that it was going to be Donald Trump as the nominee, then we obviously engaged more, and we continue to treat Donald Trump as a serious candidate. And up and through the convention, and after the convention, they started the pre-election transition. And so we treated both, Donald Trump and clearly Hillary Clinton. We treated them both seriously and developed relationships with both. And despite the fact that a lot of people were surprised on election night when Donald Trump won, we at least had opposed to many others, had at least laid some sort of foundation. I say all that to say that you really, and a lot of this is just learning by experience, but it pays to cover every contingency, because particularly in the world of politics and elections, you never know what the outcome may be. Just as we sit here in 2020, where so many of the polls are saying that Joe Biden, former vice president, will likely be elected. I remind clients and friends and many others that you only have to look back to 2016 to see where sometimes what you think may happen may not happen. And so if you're in a company and you're trying to do contingency planning, or if you're in an agency, whether it be public affairs or public relations or government relations, and you need to make sure that you're doing well by playing out every scenario and being serious and treating everybody seriously in that respect. Like I said, and I will come back to any other Microsoft examples, pulling from that experience as need be through Q&A, et cetera. let me then say, when I left Microsoft in last September, I signed up with a friend of mine who I'd known for almost, I've known all the way back to the Bush administration, Christine Davies. She founded the Poligage, which is a government affairs, public affairs expert platform, taken in account sort of, applying sort of the model from Airbnb and Uber and other marketplace platforms, but applying that to the government affairs public policy arena. And she had left her company back about 6 months previous, and we'd sit down right at the time I was leaving Microsoft and asked if I would be an advisor. And I said gladly, because I was, I could be particularly helpful, and all the different consultants and experts that I've worked with over the years, both pre-Microsoft and during Microsoft, and we hired tons of external consultants, both at the federal, state level. I could help bring on and get experts onto our platform so that they would be available for startups, medium-sized companies, large companies to on demand through an hourly consultation basis, be able to tap into some very high level experience that ordinarily you would have to pay $10, $15, $20, $25,000 a month for. So using the online platform as an on-demand, and these are experts who are already in their day jobs. They may have their own firm, they may be part of a large firm, and in some cases we have multiple people from the same firm. But they are our goal is we launched in May and already have over 100 experts who cover the gamut from we've got former ambassadors, former senior White House officials, former corporate trade association officials, former chiefs of staffs to governors, former senior advisors to prime ministers. But whether you're talking about the international capital space, where you're talking about Washington, D.C. or state capitals, we want to make sure that we're covered there on the platform, so that if somebody has a particular need where they would be glad to pay somebody in a 30-minute or an hour increment, they would be able to get very senior level expertise sort of on a as you go on demand basis. So this is a bit groundbreaking. There are many of you hearing this, there are other service platforms out there today that have popped up in the last few years, and there are several that have huge experts base, but most of the ones that tangentially touch what I'm talking about here are very business deal centric, and they're based in New York or London or Germany, and they're called GLG or GuidePoint or some of these other names, where they will reach out through LinkedIn and hire up, well, not hire, but ask an expert whether they would affiliate with them. And they have tens of thousands of experts in some cases, so that and some of them may be public policy or government affairs experts and are political experts who could help provide a data point for a given client through the platform that could come into play regarding a business deal. Poligage is really the first platform that has been built from the ground up that is a pure play when it comes to government affairs, but also more broadly public affairs, which includes the communication surrounding everything about influencing government and and having practitioners on there who can provide that sort of level of information. And so anyway, we're off to the races on Poligage, and it's really exciting. We hope to ultimately have by the end of next year about 500 experts, again, global, and we may go north of that, but at the end of the day, we want to make sure that all the experts that we have on, we can seriously say that we've worked with these experts. These are very high level, these are high quality folks who can give you very good counsel. And if a client wants to then go and hire and retain that expert off the platform, then clearly that's available, and that's a great benefit for many of our experts. We're very excited about that. And of course, we're seeing that type of platform come in any shapes or forms, across many different sectors. And so now it's found its way into the government affairs and public affairs sector. At the same time, while being an advisor to Poligage, I also stood up, actually repurposed a firm that my wife and I had started back for her when she left Thomson Reuters back about 12 years ago, where she was primarily doing management consulting. I've expanded it, I've come on as president, I've expanded it into public affairs, which includes government affairs, also corporate social responsibility, CSR, as we say, and philanthropy. And I brought on several partners in these key areas who have long track records, like I would like myself in these spaces, and have worked for big corporate brands who we think can help provide really valuable counsel to companies, whether they be startups on how to do it, or whether they be the largest companies on the planet in terms of giving them some new thinking, et cetera. And the thought process here behind mixing this sort of public affairs, CSR, and philanthropy is what I came to really appreciate at Microsoft in my work there, as I worked across the corporate affairs buckets, as I worked with my colleagues in CSR, as I worked with my colleagues in philanthropy, if I worked with my colleagues who are day-to-day communication practitioners. What I found is that, in any company of any size, it's very quickly you get into the stovepipe mentality where everybody is in their own lane and they're doing their own thing, and when they need to or think they have to, they will share. But by and large, there's not, in many cases, surprisingly, there's not really good collaboration. What we found at Microsoft, particularly over the last 10 years, and what I found was that those days we were having our best day when I, as a government affairs public policy practitioner, was working closely with my CSR and philanthropy colleagues and my communication colleagues. So if we were on the same page and thinking about how we could move the dial for Microsoft together, and I could leverage the really good work that's going on in the CSR space, in the philanthropy space, in a very credible, in a very credible way, those spaces naturally build trust with communities, with decision makers, with the public at large. And so it becomes very, very important that while you're building that trust then can be brought to bear if you do it the right way in the government affairs, government policy space. And why not? Again, you have to be serious about it. You have to be persistent. You have to be consistent. But at the same time, if you look right and left and work with some of these important corporate affairs functions across the company, what I found is that you have a lot more success in both the business impact and your public policy, goals and objectives and political goals, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we're trying to do at New Lantern. Let me touch on, Mary Beth mentioned the reputation management book. It's sort of how I, outside of my day jobs, how I've also come to think about reputation, integrity, et cetera. In 2005, after I've been at Microsoft for a couple of years, a mutual friend put me together with the new head of the New York University's NYU's graduate program in corporate communication. And he and a partner, another NYU business school crisis management professor, they were writing a book on reputation management. It was the first of its kind. And he said, I think smartly so, he said, Ed, we've got about 12 chapters that we've laid out on what we think, practitioners, whether they're graduate students, whether they're corporate or agency practitioners, what they should take away from this textbook. One of those that we really would like to have is government relations. We've got media relations, we've got investor relations, we've got, all the different types, internal, public relations, internal communications. What we don't really have is anybody who can write to, on government relations, where government is the audience. And would I take this on and write the chapter? And I was relatively new at Microsoft, and I said, oh, wow, I don't know if I have the time. But I said, look, if you let me do it over August when things in DC are a little quieter during our congressional recess, I'm happy to do it. And I did it, and it's been just a wonderful project ever since. And we just in July of this year, released our 4th edition. So at every edition, at every stop, we obviously update it across the board with new. We have in our chapters, and my chapter is about 14,000 words. And so I cover a good bit of ground, but in each of these chapters, we're bringing in new voices, in sidebar conversations and interviews, et cetera, while also obviously over the last 15 years have made sure that we're bringing in and reflecting the new technology, social media, et cetera. We're also, obviously, we're spending more time in the reputation management book now, talking about talking about diversity and inclusion than we did on the first one, and rightfully so. And so we try to make it of the moment. And so we just released that, and it's been a great, it's been a great opportunity. And I'll come back to it in just a second as we talk about the code of ethics. At the same time, I was asked by the same NYU program director if I would. He knew my wife at the time was up with Thomson Reuters in New York and going back and forth, and we had an apartment up there. And would I actually teach a course in the spring over some Saturdays? And once again I said, wow, I got a day job and that take a lot out of me, but how do I pass up an opportunity like this? Because I love the classroom. I love to talk in real time about these things. I think it's a great learning experience. And I can learn from it as well. And so I took that on and did that for seven years and taught the government relations course as part of the graduate corporate communication program at NYU. I will brag and say that at least for a couple of years, NYU's graduate CorpCom program was ranked the #1 in the country. And I'd like to think it was because they were there in New York, and people like John Doorley, who was the program manager, was very smartly bringing in real-time practitioners who could bring that sort of insight into the classroom, and particularly at the graduate level, how important that was. And so loved that. I rotated out of that in 2013, frankly, when my wife left Thomson Reuters, and we no longer had the apartment in New York, but really enjoyed that experience. One other data point I should make you aware of: in Washington, D.C., there is an organization that was started back in the early 80s. It's called the Bryce Harlow Foundation. And this gets to integrity and reputation and ethics. Obviously, the lobbying industry has been kicked around, and rightfully so in some cases, for various bad apples over the course of history. We're an easy target for our industry, and lobbyists are an easy target for people running for office. Whether you're Barack Obama or Donald Trump, you hit the lobbyists. But at the end of the day, they're lobbyists for trade unions, or lobbyists for corporations, or lobbyists for interest groups, and for teachers, et cetera, for literally every walk of life. And their voice needs to be heard in some way. And so there's an organization, as I mentioned, with Bryce Harlow Foundation. It was founded in the early 80s. That was named after Bryce Harlow, who is credited back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s as really creating the current, what we consider the current day government relations practice in Washington, D.C. He was an advisor, a senior advisor in the White House to Presidents Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford. He ran the legislative affairs within the White House. And then when he left, he was hired by Procter & Gamble, probably the largest company, one of the top 5 companies, back in the 70s. And he started their government relations practice and really built it. And what made him unique was that he had such a great reputation from both sides of the aisle, a reputation both with members of Congress and with White House officials, whether they be of his party or the other party. As I sort of touched on earlier, his word was his bond. He treated us as such. He did it with great humility. And so when he passed away, friends came together and named a foundation for him to say, we need to embody what Bryce Harlow had sort of started out, and the importance of integrity and reputation and ethics, and really embody that. And not just embody it, but also teach the next generations of folks who want to go into this profession. So that's exactly what Bryce Harlow Foundation has done. It hosts a big dinner every year, and the proceeds of that go into scholarships for graduate level students who are, their day jobs are on the Hill or in administration or in a company government affairs office, but they really see themselves as going into to government relations. And so with that, they also promote, every year they will give an award to somebody in the profession who has really distinguished themselves as a senior member who, again, who really is considered high reputation, high integrity, et cetera, et cetera. So I was invited to be part of and be a member of that board back while I was at Microsoft, and I served 2 terms, and I also served as chairman of the Bryce Harlow Foundation. So once again, I found it very important to for our profession to make sure that we were shining light on those who did it well, but also help encouraging and reminding each other how we could be better every day at these sorts of things. In the chapter, and I'll sort of wind up my comments with this, and then we'll turn to Q&A. But in the chapter that I talked about, the reputation management book, I spend quite a bit of time in the latter part of the chapter I talk about the Bryce Harlow Foundation and what's going on there. I talk about my own best practices that I consider. But there's also just a code of ethics that our profession, the government relations profession, heeds to. And they have remained very consistent over, as I've been tracking them. When I included the code in my chapter back in 2005, which was published in 2000, first published in 2007. So at least going back 15 years, these have remained very consistent with a couple of differences that I can call out. But some of these are not surprising, and I know that PRCA and other organizations have similar, but it's important for us to always remember that at the core, for us to really be seen and to have that important foundational ethical, grounded in ethics that I mentioned at the top, that we have a code that we adhere to, and that we make sure that others in our profession adhere to, whether they're just starting out or whether they're somebody who's been in it 35 years and they need a good refresher. And first and foremost, there's 9 articles, and the first one is on honesty and integrity. And as I call it in my best practices, just shoot straight, tell the truth. Don't try to cut a corner, or it will come back and bite you. In so many ways, and not only impact your own credibility, but impact that of whether it's a client or whether it's a company that you're working for. And the second article is adhering to compliance with applicable laws, regulation, and rules. And that sounds like an easy sort of throwaway. Okay, sure, I will do that. I will say that the rhetoric around that second article has changed a bit. In the last time I included the ethics, believe it or not, it said, a lobbyist should seek to comply fully with laws, regulation, and rules applicable to a lobbyist. That's actually a little bit stunning, because it says they should seek to comply. Well, the language and the amended ethics today now say that I include in the latest chapter, it says that they should comply. So there's no seeking there. So anyway, that is super important. And when I talk about this in terms of best practice, I say follow the law and the rules and then some. Because in some cases, as you know, if something is perfectly legal, it may not be in your best interest to do it anyway, because it will bring bad attention to your client, your company, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important, and my rule of thumb is follow the law and the rules and then some when it makes sense. Third article is professionalism. Is basically, it's reminding our folks in our business to act professionally. It's nothing more complex than that. The fourth is conflicts of interest. And I know when I was a consultant, as part of the WPP firm, we spent a lot of time thinking about conflicts of interest. We clearly thought a lot about it when I was at Microsoft. If you've got firms working for you, and let's say, Microsoft is really, an aggressive competitor to Amazon, for example, you have to really think through conflicts of interest. And for a practitioner, you need to think through, how does it hurt my credibility if on one day I'm talking to a decision maker about a given issue and I'm representing this client, and a month later I'm talking to them about a different client and they may have different positions. So it's on that practitioner to make sure that they are very comfortable and there's no conflicts, and that needs to be written into the agreements that they have. You know, the fifth, pardon me, article is due diligence and best efforts. You know, do your best work for that client. It sort of goes without saying that you should, but you know, we've all witnessed people coasting sometimes when it comes to doing work. Is that you need to, you know, give your 100% for that client, because if you're seen as not having your heart into it and not believing what you're saying yourself, then you're surely not going to be a very strong and effective advocate on behalf of your client, whether your client is the company you work for, or a client if you're in a consulting arrangement. 6 is compensation engagement terms. You know, there needs to be, you know, it needs to be written down. There needs to be black and white. It needs to pass muster in how it's done and be done ethically. It needs to call out things like gift laws and point out to federal and state and other international laws that it adheres to, but there needs to be good written agreements and documentation. Confidentiality is the next one, in terms of encouraging, you know, obviously is treating client information as confidential. Public education is the 8th article, and public education means, you know, as somebody in the industry, you need to yourself do a good job explaining the importance of why somebody in this profession, you know, that is frankly contained in the First Amendment, you know, with peaceable assembly and also freedom of religion, et cetera. There's also freedom to petition your government. And so you need to be a good advocate for the profession and educating people of its importance. And finally, just the duty to government institutions, which I think is an important one. Not only should you have a duty to do right by your clients, but the government institutions that you're working for, or that you're engaging, you need to treat them with respect. You need to show humility when, you know, when you're working with a government, whether it's a career public servant or whether it's a political public servant. You need to show a great level of respect for these people that you're dealing with. Mary Beth, I think I'll stop right there. I think that'll leave some time for the Q&A that you'd asked me to do. I've got my clock right over here, so I've been watchful of that.
And I so appreciate, these have been wonderful comments, and I just appreciate so much your sharing this knowledge and the background that you've had, and just this illustrious career that you've had with all of these different entities and just all of these different experiences, and especially with these institutions that you're now part of and that you're now able to share with us. I love the comment that you made just a moment ago regarding the National Institute of Lobbying and Ethics Code, and the comment about seek to comply and calling that out because of the wiggle room issue. You know, in some of our initial conversations when I made outreach to you on behalf of the PRCA, is that I made the comment to you that the PRCA has what may be one of the only compliance-driven ethics codes in the PR industry specifically. And that's one of the things that has appealed to me. And it is one of those areas where we really try to get away from that wiggle room aspect. We really try to be a compliance-driven organization that doesn't veer toward allowing for a lot of wiggle room. We really try to hold ourselves, and it doesn't mean that everyone is always going to be perfect. I mean, I don't think that, I think that people can end up making mistakes, but I think that if you realize that you've made a mistake, trying to fix that, to identify it, to self-report, to do the things that you need to do to make corrective action is really important. But, you know, you spoke very early on in your comments about this idea of, you know, your word is your bond, you know, that modus operandi. You talked about colleagues with whom you worked earlier in your career, and even at present day, and with the Bryce Harlow Foundation and some of these other entities, and certainly those, you know, all these colleagues that you have where that is the ethic, you know, your word is your bond. And that people that you're working with, that people didn't take every client that walked in the door, that having some discernment about who you're working with. How much is that overall ethic as pervasive now, you think, as it perhaps was maybe decades ago, or that you would have observed in working in the in the sector where you're working in government relations? Is there as much of that mindset as there once was, or do you feel like that's more challenged nowadays?
Well, I think frankly, there's as much of it today as there was 20, 25 years ago, in terms of people having their own sort of North Star on your word is your bond, speak truthfully, admit when you don't know something, go back and get the answer. So I think that really hasn't changed. What's changed is this sort of the environment in which we're working. And so it would give you, and of course, the bad, just given the nature of information, 24-hour cycles and media, and social media, et cetera, when there is a bad actor or a bad player, then that, we're all exposed to that much more quickly. And so it would give the appearance that people may be, generally speaking, more fast and loose with this sort of stuff. But I honestly don't think that this all comes down to personal integrity. Mm-hmm. Whether you're a doctor, a teacher, or you own, you're a used car dealer, or you're a lobbyist, personal integrity is up to you. And those you want to do business with, or who you have done business with, are folks who are going to, they will remember if you said or did something that somehow was less than truthful or was convenient for you. A good example that you see a lobbyist fall in the trap to is when you're in and let's say you're lobbying a cabinet secretary or a member of Congress or a governor, et cetera, and you're trying to get them to support some policy, that whether it's in legislation or regulation or whatever, and you're given all the pros of why they should support it. It's very easy for you to leave out who may be against it. If they're doing their job, and I've been on the government side, you're saying, well, this all sounds good to me, but who would be against what you're talking about? If you cut corners there, you've really done yourselves, if you try to give the impression that, well, there's very few people against it, or no one is really raising red flags over this, or, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not the full truth, and that's really going to come back and bite you. So you need to be open and honest. So if somebody says, if a congresswoman says, well, who's against this? You need to say, well, look, here's who you'll probably hear from, and here's what they'll say. And we've looked at those issues closely, but here's how we think we address those. Say it that way and call it out up front. In fact, I would, in many cases, I would not wait for them to ask the question. I would tell them up front, as part of what you're doing, is that, look, here's what we're for, here's what we're doing, here's why it's good. Now, some will say, but here's why we think they're wrong, and they're wrong for these reasons, and we're working to alleviate these issues even more.
Mm-hmm. I think those are such excellent points. I wish that we saw more of that, particularly in the media, or in, say, media interviews. And I'm thinking about cable news and everything else. If we saw more of that in type of inquiry and exchange modeled, I think in public exchanges, and whether it's, of course, political debates too, I think that in the mindset that would be something that was maybe more modeled behind closed doors, perhaps. Unfortunately, I think that gets lost in the shuffle, because of we see so much bad behavior modeled in more public forums.
Every good decision maker needs to have both sides of the issue, and to be able to weigh that. And if you're an advocate for these sets of issues, it's your job to help that. And then they can go and talk to the other side, and they should talk to the other side. But it all needs to be done, with everything on the table.
Exactly. I would agree. I mean, having a balanced approach, I think, instills credibility from everyone. We've had a question come in through the discussion queue. David Gallagher, who's actually my co-chair on the PRCA Ethics Council, writes, "Thank you, Ed, great talk." He says, regarding conflicts of interest, it's clearly a problem to use or misuse information from one party against another. And he says, I can see a potential issue when representing opposing parties, but is it a conflict of interest to merely advise competing clients? So, and I think that that's something that a lot of public relations firms, or a lot of, well, it can even be law firms, or, you know, a lot of different types of advisory or consultancies, whether in the government relations sector or not, that they run up against. And maybe part of that is a disclosure issue, it can probably run up against what are the circumstances of the competition, for example. What's your reaction to that?
Well, and that's exactly the type of thing that I dealt with for 16 years at Microsoft, is overseeing our contractual relationships and our relationship with all the different consultants. And these questions came up regularly. I will say that in the legal profession, law firms generally have a bit more flexibility in representing competitors, because they can compartmentalize and say, okay, well, we're helping this business of this company, whereas over here, we're helping this business with that company, and we're providing this legal service. Now, there's no reason that a government relations or a PR firm can do the same thing, but it's harder because in our business, in the PR and the government relations space, we in many cases are the public face for that company on that set of issues. So despite the fact that it may be a different part of the company, a great example is, you know, Amazon has, you know, they're a huge competitor to Microsoft in a number of spaces, right? And so, and there's big time competition in the cloud space, as you see. And then there's some spaces there's no competition whatsoever. You know, if Microsoft is for Microsoft or Amazon in one area and turns around as being the public face, even though it's in a separate area, that really has to be balanced. And so, and it's always a moving target too, because as you know, with the way, you know, the marketplace is working now, and industry, and, you know, who's the person who may be the companies may be very much in line today, they may be very much at odds tomorrow. And what that means is that you're, as a consultant, you may very much have non-competitors today, but a month from now, they could be competitors, and you've got to work through that. In some cases, you can build up a wall around discrete works using the, you know, borrowing a page from the law firm. But again, if it's something that's going to have a high profile, and there's, you know, and you're going to be competitors in a very high profile way, despite it being in different parts of the company, you need to think, and you need to think both as the company who's hiring the consultant, are we sending the wrong message by continuing to have that consultant represent us when now we're in this sort of conflict or competitive situation? And frankly, the consultant needs to be able to say, am I doing right by either client? Now, clearly, the first client typically who have dibs over, at least has a right of first refusal to say, we've had you on the, you know, you've been representing us for quite some time. Now there's a conflict. We don't think there's a way to work around it. So we strongly suggest that you only work for us. So you get into all these sorts of conversations, given this is all very fluid. But generally speaking, you really need to step back and look both in GR and PR and say, by virtue of them being the public face on an issue, and if they are a public face, in some cases it could be quiet counsel, but if they are a public face, are you doing more damage and reputational damage potentially?
Right, right. It seems that disclosure is the key word. I mean, would you agree with that? That you know, the disclosure of interests and being sure that everyone is on this level playing field of who is being represented, and making sure that a party is not being left in the dark
Yeah.
about that.
Definitely disclosure. Your contractual agreement with a consultant, it needs to spell out that if and when a conflict may present itself, you need to make us aware. So there's the internal private disclosure. That's a must. But then what you may also be referencing is the public disclosure, or a disclosure if you're having a conversation with somebody to say, let's say I'm having a conversation with the congressman and saying, as you may know, we've long represented so-and-so over here, but on this specific issue, disclosure can help in that regard, but it's not going to be the panacea in some cases, particularly if it's something that's gotten to be very high profile. I mean, think of what's going on with TikTok and who's going to buy it, and the race to on that, and the issues related to China, and the issues related to the Trump administration. All a very fluid game, and so playing out very publicly in the press, and so. All the disclosure in the world won't necessarily fix it. In some cases, you may just have to back out of an agreement with a client, or a client may have to step up and say, "Look, let's table your relationship with us for now."
Right. What do people who work in government relations get wrong the most, or most often, from the vantage point of ethics? In most cases, I mean, from your observation, what do you think is the most common error? Or, I mean, is it some of these issues we've discussed or just now touched on? Do you think that those are the most common points of error?
I do think it's being fully truthful. I mean, many of us are in relationships with a spouse or a partner or whatever. I mean, it's one thing to say, but the omission can be a crime as well sometimes. And so if you're being, as I mentioned before, if you're not being upfront with whoever you are lobbying to sort of say, here's the lay of the land, here's where things stand, here's where all the sides are. That's where I think people other practitioners get into trouble pretty quickly, and it's fairly common when they choose not to provide some of that information, because you're only going to have so many shots at a given cabinet secretary or a governor or a senator or a congressperson or a staff person. And if you're seen as not being fully truthful with them or providing with the full set of facts, not that you're lying, but you may be omitting something that's critical for them to know, they're not going to host a meeting with you that often after that fact.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, it was fascinating to hear you talk about the scope of relationship building across the aisle. You spoke about covering every contingency in that relationship building process. And one question that I had was, what does one do, and how are the conflicts handled when the question maybe is put to you when you're in that relationship building process with various candidates or various interests, when the candidate himself or herself or their staff persons tell you that the relationship is wholly contingent upon you're not having a relationship with the other guy or gal.
and insinuating that. I can't say that it typically doesn't happen blatantly, but there is sometimes the impression that is left that is the case. Look, it's politics, and politics can get brutal. I mean, and that's another hat that I wore for Microsoft for 16 years as sort of the political director, is thinking through in any given election cycle and everything in between is how we handle these various questions when somebody comes in and says, generally speaking, we've always wanted to make sure, like right now, there's a chance that the Senate potentially could flip to a Democratic majority, right? And while I was at Microsoft for 16 years, we saw a lot of these flippings. And of course, and also during my time before that, where the House and Senate both flipped to Republican for the first time in years and years and years in 1994, when I was at the consulting firm. You have to always play both, like I said, play for every contingency in presidential, in presidential elections. You also have to play for every contingency and build relationships, long-term relationships, starting day one. If in fact the Senate flips to Democrat, you should not run over and just say, okay, now we'll only talk to Democrats and not Republicans. What you need to do is have an even-handed approach to all sides. And it will alleviate some of these problems. So if you're seen as somebody who has worked with Republicans and Democrats, no matter whether at the time they were minority or majority, obviously you have to respect the majority because they do control the clock, the agenda, etc. But with that said, they still have important votes. And so you need to be even-handed on both sides, whether it's through political giving, through a political action committee, or whether it's through your general engagement. You need to be seen as willing to work with both sides on issues where it can help your company or client play that evenly. Because as soon as ever, there'll be some companies who will race over and say, okay, now let's only work with Democrats, for example, if they take over the majority in the Senate side. That would be the wrong play. Clearly, you need to go and respect the fact that you're going to have new majority, majority leaders and new committee majority, et cetera, and people in those people says, it's, sure enough, the tide will turn. It could potentially turn 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 6 years from now, but you need to be even-handed on both sides.
Well, this has just been fascinating, and I know that we're here up on our time. There are so many other questions I would love to ask, but just in the interest of that, hopefully we can have you back again, Ed, at some point in the near future. And you've just been so insightful to us, and we look forward to sharing this with our audience. And you've just been a wealth of knowledge, especially during Ethics Month, and really putting forward a lot of really important messages that our membership really needs and wants to hear. So thanks so much for sharing with us, especially as we're at a really critical time in the United States, a real critical decision time. And so thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ed, for sharing with us.
Great to be with you today.